Hello everyone and welcome back. Really excited to introduce this session because one of our big themes that has emerged from discussions this morning is about the importance of critical thinking. It's one thing to say that, but in an age of misinformation or disinformation, a word that was used quite heavily 2 days ago on this stage, how do we go about preparing young people to deal with that massive information, to sift the fact from the fiction? So to help us explore this, I'd like to welcome our chair, Iain Anderson.
Thank you, Robert. Hey, well, look, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've all been sustainably fed. And I don't know whether or not this is the traditional graveyard shift, but hopefully there's something buzzing inside you to get our conversation going this afternoon. So look, without any more ado, let's welcome our fantastic panel, Pedro, Donald, and Zubeda. Come and join me on stage. Great. I hope you're all feeling sustainably fed and ready to go. We're going to have some, hopefully, disagreement, because that's a good idea, I think, sometimes when you're having these debates, but not violent disagreement in any way, shape, or form. So this session, critical thinking in an age of misinformation, when we're kind of reading headlines today, positively and negatively. One of our social media platforms clearly being accused, I'm not even going to name it, clearly being accused of spreading yet more disinformation than ever. And yet the anti-climate change, if I can put him that way, blogger that has repented for what he did to Sussex University about a decade ago. So it's certainly taken him a decade to wake up and smell the coffee, if you like, but he's done that. What we want to try and do in this session, though, is just explore the level of misinformation that's going to go on. We've got academics, think tankers, and one of this country's most prominent journalists to be able to do that. And I think, hopefully, in terms of the dynamic in this conference, try and get to some solutions. Not just talk about it, but try and get to some solutions. Well, look, I'm feeling quite hopeful, I must admit. I probably learned more about climate in the last 5 or 6 days than I've learned in the previous 5 or 6 years. Let's go down the panel. Pedro, let me kind of start with you with a sort of provocation on this Youth and Empowerment Day. Are we going backwards, really badly backwards in terms of misinformation, or are there reasons for hope?
The boring answer is both, but I want to formulate it in a different way. Today I've heard a lot of pleas for critical thinking in this room, but I'm not just sure that everyone wants this. Because if you take the anti-vaxxers, if you take the climate change deniers, they do a certain form of critical thinking. Maybe we have even more critical thinkers now than ever. And if you want people to think like you don't want critical thinking, you want followers, social media. But if we want to move beyond this, then we have to look back to some research, and then it's getting quite depressing. For instance, if you look at PISA, everybody is talking always about rankings in PISA, but they also look on how good young people are dealing, age 15, with information. And then you get depressed, because then we see that a lot of young people, they can read, but understanding what they read is a very different element. And if you look at another study, 2017 or 18 in the United States, they looked even at the best honor students of the top universities, but they also are being convinced by an image rather than a source. So to find a solution, if you look at the old simple view on reading, then it's a multiplication. It's decoding multiplied by comprehension. And the most important element in this case is multiplication. So if you only feed young people information, if you give them background knowledge, that's key. But that's not enough. Because if it's multiplication, if you leave one thing off the table, then the end result is nothing. The second element is something. Can I do an experiment with this?
Oh, a really quick experiment.
Yeah,
Go
okay. I have a quick question, sorry for you. Can I introduce to you Linda? Linda is 32 years old, studied philosophy in Oxford, and really likes poetry. Can you imagine Linda? Yeah? Now I have a simple question for you. Linda, 32 years, philosophy, poetry, works in a bank. That's option 1. Or option 2, Linda, 32 years old, likes poetry, studied philosophy, works in a bank, and is really, really into human rights. Which option is the most logical one? She works in a bank, or she works in a bank and also is very strong on human rights. Who says option 1? Not that many. Option 2? Well, if you look all the Lindas who studied philosophy and who are very fond of poetry, that's this circle. And a small group works in a bank, and even a smaller group is also into human rights. What I just demonstrated is one of the biggest biases we have, the confirmation bias. I only gave you 3 elements, but you already knew, oh, I know Linda. She never would work in a bank if she is very fond of human rights.
Okay.
And that's the confirmation bias. So we need, besides background knowledge, we need to give them the opportunity to learn the biases.
Right. I feel like we should invite Linda up on the panel in a minute, actually, to talk about that. Great. Zubeda, are we going forwards? Are we going backwards on this one?
So I won't be a Linda on this, obviously. However, let me start maybe by putting forward the proposition first, which is the question itself. It's quite yes, no, true, false. So the dichotomy of choice is false from that point of view. And if we're talking about critical thinking, if we're talking about educators, if we're talking about students, we need to get the grey areas within the discussion, because I think one of the points around the environment is often couched in, are you for this or are you against this? So we simplify, first of all, that discussion. Do you think social media has got more of a handle on this than traditional media, for example? So it kind of, again, pits one against the other. And I think that question in itself kind of manifests what that initial problem is. I won't dwell too much onto this, but perhaps we can explore it further. When it comes to critical thinking, I think it's really important that where educators have the power, because again, listening to some of the sessions this morning, when we talk about critical thinking, when we talk about educators, I think we're looking at it, we're excluding the concept of power within this, and because the classroom has an essence of power, it's all very well saying to young people that you have the solutions, you are the agents of change, when in fact we are working within the power parameters that also operate. So critical thinking would be fundamental in the sense of the power that we would empower young people as the agents of change, but what will they be? Because it's very easy to say we're giving you the power, but when people challenge you, how will you interact with that?
Right.
And I'm also very much for disruption. So one of the things that I was kind of perhaps weighing quite heavily, I'm still not quite sure I've got the equation on this, but one is we talk a lot topics both to students and young people, and we have something called kind of where that power parameter exists. So when you move from an idea which in a democratic society, so crossing the line is my middle line, where you move from a democratic society in terms of encouraging people to push for change, where you challenge power, doing so, protest, for example, and then when you cross the line, it's using violence to achieve those aims becomes problematic. So we then mention some of our role models, whether we talk about Greta Thunberg, whether we talk about Nelson Mandela, whether we talk about all these in the Rosa Parks. They pushed for change, but they did cross the line. So within the concept of environment, within the concept of critical thinking, when we equip someone with that power, where who draws those kind of power parameter shifts, and what do we do with it? So I'm not going to answer it yet, but I feel I'm going to kind of push that into this equation, because it's important that we shift the neatness of the discussion into a lot of the grey areas. And a final point that I kind of want to maybe throw out there is about agency and diversity. So, being a very visible Asian lady born in the UK, I often feel that this debate is often couched from a power perspective of race within the global north, putting forward some of those suggestions and actually incorporating that power. We often, again, exclude the voices and the visibility of voices of people who are also already going through the shift in environment. So when we talk about diversity, when we talk about young people, are we putting in our own biases as educators and as teachers? So are we putting in that bias from that forefront? And then are we excluding the voices that need to be heard because we want to contain that neatness within there? So who are the role models that we are pushing? And are we pushing them as well? So I'm going to kind of leave those provocations there.
No. So kind of neurodiversity, I definitely want to kind of come back to. Donald, we're doing this conversation, just as I said up front, one of the biggest social media platforms is again being accused of, in this conversation, spreading more misinformation than ever. Again, where do you think we are as editor of a newspaper right in the heart of the COP city? Are you feeling positive?
I'm feeling relatively positive. It's a bit of a fudge of an answer, but I think there's more agreement and alignment around established facts. I think also there's greater acceptance of the spread of misinformation. So you're kind of balancing both of that. What worries me is I think there's still too much emotion. And for me, that's all about, as you've talked about, the reinforcement of some ill-informed views. And I'm concerned about the future generations coming through. Are we preparing them right so that they can have an intelligent, rational debate? And I don't think we're doing that. I think it's incredibly hard for us to do that. But is there a safe space for healthy debate? I look at it from a newspaper point of view. Probably my printed letters pages are, because I'm moderating that, and there isn't, we talked off stage about when we used to get crackpot letters and people criticizing, it was always in green ink. But the beauty of print was, in the old days, you had a spike. You just put it there, or an email, you just delete. When it's online, it is horrific. It would be a full-time job for a lot of us just to moderate that, because you're criticized for holding somebody up for scrutiny. So bring it back to climate change. When there's something said and you scrutinize it, but it goes against public accepted views.
But isn't that the commercial model of our modern media? I mean, it benefits, whether or not it's a social media platform or indeed your newspaper or any newspaper, conflict, the binary choice, yes or no, for or against, drives traffic, doesn't it?
Yeah, it depends what your goal is. I can drive traffic by saying this is bad and this is exceptionally good, particularly here in Scotland. It'll be about whether it's part of the union or independence. But if your model is selling subscriptions, it's about the quality of content. And that quality of content means that we need to have in-depth analysis and insight and provide the public with a better understanding than I think they're getting if they just trawl social media.
Right, okay, so I promised you we would try and get to solutions, and I don't want to do that in the last 5 minutes. Pedro, how do we move to a conversation as opposed to this binary stuff? How do we do that amongst educators, amongst kind of my world, Donald's world, the media as well too? How do we get there as opposed to all this shouty, you're wrong, I'm right stuff?
Well, it would help if a lot of people would say, I don't know, as a starting point. And I was almost saying, I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah.
But I do think when Donald was saying, and you were explaining that there is a business model in a lot of media with conflict, luckily we have one place a lot of people have to go to that don't have to sell subscriptions, and we call it schools. Yeah. And that's a good thing. People come to school, and that's a very safe place, hopefully, it should be, like people like you are working for this, to have this kind of a debate. But it does ask a lot of teachers, but also a lot of families and the pupils and students themselves. Because, for instance, I have a very strange rule with my students. When I guide them through a paper, I tell them the first 4 weeks, I don't want to hear your opinion. And they are shocked. Because I explain to them, first I want you to read everything about the topic. And after 4 weeks, then I want to hear your opinion, because then you have the background.
Right, right, right. Zubeda, you were starting to unpack this for us. So, look, let me give you a little bit more time to do that. How do you think we get out of the binary cul-de-sac too?
So, in some ways, a quick answer is we don't, because the sands are always shifting.
Yeah.
So we will never get to that end point, first of all. However, there are lots of practical things that can happen in terms of framing discussions. So, for example, how you introduce a question. Quite often, I think some of my initial thoughts around this topic was around making sure that when we talk about the environment, and obviously there's lots of subsets within that, we don't treat it as one, we've ticked off environment in one lesson. So there are many things that we should be embedding within a whole school environment, within other subjects, the critical thinking skills that we've talked about, so, you know, embedding throughout that lifetime around the who, what, why, when, how. When it comes to, for example, social media, you could, for example, frame it in terms of where did you get that information, who provided that information, which platform did you get it from, was it from a mainstream kind of, you know, was it endorsed in different, so fact checking from different sources. And again, recognizing the fact that where we as adults may consume news might be different from a young person's consumption of news. One doesn't negate the other, but it's about learning together. The other thing is about understanding where your biases are. And again, this is something that I talked about in the morning, about confirmation bias. So what, as an educator, is your bias, recognizing your bias, and perhaps even introducing the question, making sure, sometimes there are limitations there in that question itself.
So I mean, look, we're all used to, and there is a debate about it,
Absolutely.
But, you know, unconscious bias training in terms of gender in the workplace. What about the unconscious bias wrap around this conversation? Do you think there's something in that? And I say that on a day that, you know, I think just down the road, the UK government has said, hallelujah, that it's going to bring climate into the curriculum. Go on, Pedro, you're itching to come in, and then I'll bring in Donald.
It's all about falsification. We need to learn to teach our students, but also the rest of the world, that if you have an opinion, instead of trying to find elements that support you, it's much healthier to look for a falsification of your idea. And if we learn that, well, I think we can help them be resilient against misinformation and disinformation. So the element of falsification is maybe more effective than teaching about you have this bias. No, teach them an approach to be sure.
And just very quickly, but it's also within that you then start to couch in propaganda. So you talked earlier about, you know, again, if you view something on traditional media, you might have the facility to kind of moderate, but on social media, that facility isn't there. And again, if those skill sets aren't there, it's not so much as a kind of, this is propaganda that's put out, because propaganda we view negatively, but if the critical thinking skills aren't embedded within us to question, you know, why has someone put that kind of piece out, who is behind this, and so forth, then the starting point isn't there. And as educators, we are members of society, so you can't distance what's happening in the classroom from what's happening in society as well.
No, you absolutely can't. And Donald, we were talking before we came on stage 2 about, you know, the fact that there are state actors acting around COP who are adding to that level of misinformation, yeah?
The starting point is teaching people or giving a greater understanding of how social media works and all the powerful influences. You know, there are biases, obviously. There's the spread of misinformation, disinformation, the deliberate tactics. But then it goes even further. You've got experts in social media, but why are they experts? Are they experts because lots of people piled in to say, well, we agree? And it comes back, Pedro, your point was at context. I come back to the fundamental principles of journalism, the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why. You know, I think we need to teach that so that people...
What, at school?
At school. That's cool. I love your point. Just wait 4 weeks before you offer an opinion. I think what's happening now is people are almost encouraged, and by social media, to have an opinion right away, rather than to step back. And I think what really annoys me about social media is the way it taps into emotions. So you can't calmly reflect on what has been told to you.
Okay, but can it help us? So you know, the Greta effect, the millions of young people. We've seen some of these hugely impressive students on this stage this morning who can, with their voice, reach the world. Can social media help us, Pedro?
Yes, but we have to be very much aware that we are seeing a part of the youth.
Yes.
I'm very much in favor of youngsters, but I also know the research. And then
You're in favor of young people. This is good.
Yeah.
No. Pedro is in favor of young people. This is excellent.
Sorry for my English.
Sorry.
Thank you for saving me. But the thing is, if you look at research, there are a lot of young people, older people, who are not interested in all of this, who are not taking the streets.
Right.
And actually, I think it's very easy to convince the young people who are here. But the real job is convincing the others.
The people who are not in the room.
The people who are not in the room. And I think that's sometimes overlooked if we put too much emphasis on only the young people who are doing a great job. But they are activists. We need rest.
I do think, just
briefly, Donald,
having criticised or highlighted some of the shortcomings of social media, it is a power for good, and it can be. You just need to learn to interpret it and provide context. And I say that for me is fundamentally missing, and it comes right back to education.
Right.
We need to teach people how to do that properly.
Okay, so we've got there are many teachers, educationalists in this room. I don't know if I can describe it as a room. It is a forest of ideas more than anything else. But are we, my earlier point about the UK government about to unleash this climate curriculum, do we have the teaching capabilities in place to make that work, Zubeda? Anywhere around the world, actually, not just the UK.
Yeah, it's not just about the UK. I think it's about the skill sets, about individuals, so I think the limitation is always when you're competing against time, or you feel you're competing against time to fit something into 60 minutes. And so therefore that becomes problematic, so that was my point and other people's point in terms of this has to be kind of mainstreamed into other areas so that you're not, the environment, isn't another cause that you have to subscribe to, but it's a skill set, which is what you're talking about.
What do you mean by that, mainstreamed into other areas?
So mainstreaming it in terms of we don't kind of think this is about the geography lessons, or this is something that if you join this society, then this will happen. In the same way that I would argue that when we talk about racism, for example, when we talk about deconstructing a lot of that in terms of curriculum material into history, in terms of kind of other sciences, in the same way, if we looked at the environment in our areas of work, in those diverse curriculums, you're not competing to kind of start off the discussion where you will bring in critical thinking.
So something a lot more holistic.
And then therefore it's about ownership so that we don't just see some staff members being the champions as well.
I'll come to you in a second, Pedro, but Donald,
I think it's important to understand how hard-working teachers are, and you can build it into the curriculum, but are we investing enough in teachers and teaching hours? And I think it also goes slightly beyond. It's not all about the teacher's responsibility. Are the schools bringing in outside speakers, like the panel,
Right.
to talk about these issues? Are they investing in that? But I think the biggest problem you've maybe got is that it's about exam passing, and you're judged
Right.
on your performance tables on exam results. Does that really show you how many well-rounded pupils that you have at the end who are capable of rational thought, analysing things, maybe becoming the entrepreneurs of the future who are able to provide the solutions?
So league tables are driving the binary stuff.
I think we've made a start up here in Scotland with the Curriculum for Excellence, but the minute it switches into the exam years, it's all about getting the results.
Right, okay, we're having that
So
debate.
I guess, sorry, it's a bit like saying if the infrastructure is kind of weak,
Yeah.
you're competing against a weak infrastructure to kind of then create skill sets as well.
Right, yeah, Pedro, sorry.
But sometimes we are making it too big. Because can I make it more practical? For instance, if every teacher in a school, when they are using a source, discloses how they pick that source. And just as a starting point, why I pick this source, why do I trust this source? And you do it as a model throughout every single class. It doesn't give you a lot of extra work, but it shows the pupils, and it will be much more effective than one 60-minute class about critical thinking. So I think that make it more practical, make it more achievable by asking the teachers to be good models, showing what selections they are doing, what biases they try to overcome.
And again, within that, something we touched on earlier was about what happens. So let's say we create this wonderful environment, we have the critical things embedded, but when students might be demanding as a result of those discussions, some of the changes, so some of which was talked about in the earlier sessions, what happens next? So is it enough just to provide critical thinking skills? What happens when you want some of that shift to occur within that classroom, within that environment, within that infrastructure that you've also created as well?
Yeah, and how do we create that shift, Zubeda? Let me just stay with you at the minute, because I think we're getting the general flavour through this. There are some students in the room, there are some students who lean into this, and there are millions who do not, for lots and lots of reasons. A lot down to, frankly, access and opportunity. So how do we widen that germ? How do we make that grow across the student base?
I have perhaps one element of an answer. So one is, unless you've created the environment, a democratic kind of environment, so if I can persuade you that something that I'm passionate about is, beneficial for the school, you will start to talk passionately about something. You might have student committees, for example. So again, you're harnessing the current infrastructure that's there. But again, I will come back down to, let's say we create all these committees. Let's say that the student or the students have spoken to the governors or the teachers, and yet it rests upon action. So then what will happen as a result? So I think some of that infrastructure is there. I think it's what we then do with it. So you won't win over everyone, obviously, we live in that democratic society, but what happens when that change is demanded? So I guess I'm still pushing on that one aspect of the question as well.
Yeah. Donald, what, if we look back on this week, these 2 weeks, and as I said up front, I'm certainly feeling better informed. I'm probably the rest of this audience is probably feeling better informed. But when you look at your readership, online or in print, who's tuning in? Who is interested? Is it just a small part of the population? I tried this conversation out on the way up to COP. I stopped off to do an event in Northeast England, and I said to someone yesterday, I feel more energized and more interested and more informed than ever, and they just shrugged at me. It literally said, I've just stopped watching this stuff because it makes me anxious. Because it makes me anxious. When you think about your readership, who's listening in?
Well, you've got to understand that every newspaper probably has a slightly different demographic that they're aiming for. If it's the Herald, we've got a highly educated readership who will be probably over 50, let's be honest. Online, a little bit younger. My readership tends to be, a lot of them are involved in education or maybe doctors and in public sector jobs. I think, are they listening? I can see from some of the stats online we're getting good traffic and good engagement on the environment. I don't think they engage when it's shouty and preachy.
Right. Okay. So they're turned off by the binary stuff too.
And that comes back to creating a safe space for healthy debate.
Yeah.
So my readership, how would they view the youth march? I think it'll be mixed. I think there'll be some that will say, why are they not at school? And there are some saying that it's fantastic that they're taking action. And I think it's because, do they fully understand all the issues and what's driving them? And again, this is coming down to, so ownership is on us in the media, provide the proper context.
Yeah. Pedro, from your point of view, how do we widen this conversation and get more critical thinking?
There are two elements from both of you that I want to take. And, we know from research that passion can be very contagious. But there are two kinds of passion, roughly. A negative passion and a positive passion.
Yeah.
A negative passion, that is somebody you don't want to meet in a pub because they can only talk about one thing. And then young people think, I don't want to be like that. Positive passion is somebody who has a life, who has hobbies, who has something else, but is also very passionate. We all had teachers who got us interested in topics we never thought we would be interested in. And that's the positive passion. And I think that we need role models with this kind of positive passion, because we've said here we have to think rational, but we tried this for the past 2 or 3 millennia, and we remain emotional people. So we can use this passion also in a good way, I think.
I want to come to the room, the forest, hopefully a forest of hands in a minute. So I'm going to pose one more thought to the panel, but if you've got a thought, start to put your hand up, and I'm going to try not to just go for the people at the front, and hopefully the team can let me know. What role, we talked about role models, we've talked about people who can inspire. What role do we see, again, coming out of COP, for young people to continue this momentum of, frankly, educating older generations? We've talked a lot about how educators can make this happen, but what role for young people in media, generating the ideas, or indeed actually coming up with the thoughts themselves to drive the curriculum, to drive the change the step change that we need to see? Pedro.
What I really liked for the past 2 years with all the climate marches by young people, sorry, I did it again, sorry, is most of the time they were asking questions. And asking questions is a very good starting point.
Yeah.
If I look to some of the people who were leading the marches in my own country, they said, we want to listen to scientists answering these questions. Yeah. And I think that's a great starting point. That's the beginning of critical thinking, asking questions.
Zubeda.
Oh, sorry.
It's all right. I think it's also, again, reflecting on a lot of the young people that talk about these issues. One thing that I've learned is about climate anxiety. So
yes.
It's really important that we take what young people are saying to us, the way and the manner in which young people are engaging and are already engaged, in a way that informs us, so that, again, it's about where, if we're saying that this issue is going to impact on you 30% more than it's impacting on our generations, then again, how are we listening to those voices? Second thing is also about the complexity of the issue. So when we talk about the environment, which bit of the environment are we talking about? The bit that they can impact on, the bit that gives them that power already in that space, And the bit to ask those questions, so whether that's in a public space where they're learning, but they're also engaging, where are those spaces? So whether it's traditional media, again, I think I'd be interested in learning if we have a traditional media in the sense of the Herald, if you're saying your age demographic is, specific from that point of view. So where is it that young people have that voice to engage and kind of put forward some of those views when something is so specific from that point of influence and complexity as well. So.
Yeah, Donald, I mean, look, it's a great challenge. Where do they have that voice? Just listening to the radio on the way into COP today, this sense that, young people really are being listened to, but is it just for this moment? How do we, how many young columnists do you have? How can media kind of lift those voices in a more permanent way?
Simple economics. The future's the younger generation. We need to tap into it. We need to have more young voices coming through, but I've also got to balance it against some of my more traditional columnists that have built up a following over years. But what's great about this week is you see young activists being confident enough to challenge those in power. That's a real strength in that. I'm positive about that. And then bringing it back, young people, I think more and more young people are interested in the subject and going, will I get into the science? Shall I study it? Shall I try and find a solution? And I think it's helped stimulate views. Well, they always have over time, but right now they're at the heart, or perceived to be at the heart, of the solution for climate change.
Yeah. Let's go to the floor. Are there any hands that we can see? Yeah, great. Go on.
Hi, I have a question that kind of ties in what you were talking about with your readership, how it tends to be more academic. Maybe they have, a higher level of schooling. And also tying in those that are really, the youth activists that are involved tend to be kind of from that demographic typically, maybe a more privileged background, maybe had the resources and time to kind of start their own organizations or the time to really get involved in the climate activist space. So my question is, especially when it comes to using media as a tool of education, how do you go about including students from low-income backgrounds or students from more disadvantaged backgrounds in climate education?
Right, let's go to Zubeda first. I mean, you talked about democratizing this conversation. That's the democratizing question. What do you think?
I guess it's a bit, it's no different, that question. It's a very difficult question to grapple with, but it's no different from when we talk about representation in politics. It's no different from the fact and the reality that the environment impacts on us all, and yet the spaces that we've already created, the infrastructure that's there, excludes a lot of those people who might not be involved because those forums exclude, whether purpose or by design. So I think it's about what we would normally say, which is go out and find these people to then encourage, because quite often we use the word hard to reach, but actually they're not hard to reach. It's just the fact that we don't know how to reach them. So I think that's the starting point for me. It's our fault and our problem in terms of how we create and recreate those same problems.
Or, Pedro, education models don't want to reach them for lots of reasons.
Quite often we do want to reach them, but those schools or the children who are in those schools quite often, well, there is a lot of people coming in and out as a teacher. There's a lot of issues with retention of teachers, and to have role models for a longer time, you need teachers for a longer time. So I think investing in schools so that good teachers stick there with more challenging conditions, I know, this could be a starting point for a lot of issues, not only for climate change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is more fundamental stuff. Yeah, Donald, your view on this one.
Well, just bringing it back to the point, I think we are now getting more people from different demographics and younger into media than we ever did before, because quite frankly, they are the social media experts, and people like me are regarded as dinosaurs. I might have a nice iPhone, but they know how to use it to reach a wider audience, so we're tapping into them. the biggest danger we've probably got is that some of the youngsters come through are still emotional and passionate about things and want to report on that, whereas our model was more about objectivity. So it's just harnessing the two together. But I think there are greater opportunities to get involved.
Look, I would love to continue this conversation a bit longer, but the clock is ticking in every sense directly in front of me. I hope you've been sustainably fed in terms of your minds in this conversation. I've hugely enjoyed it, and I hope we haven't been too Jurassic in terms of our thinking in this wonderful space. It's been an absolute pleasure to chair Donald, Zubeda, and Pedro. And can I ask you to join me in thanking them? Thanks, guys.
Thank you. You gave me a harder time than Iain.